In the spring of 1945, Germany no longer resembled the proud and disciplined nation it had once claimed to be. Entire cities lay in ruins, their streets lined with the skeletal remains of buildings and the silent figures of civilians moving through dust and ash. Bridges were broken, railways twisted, and the air still carried the acrid smell of burning fuel and collapsed industry. Among the debris wandered children in torn coats, their faces hollow and pale, clutching dented pots or tin cups, searching for anything edible in the rubble of their former homes. Hunger had become as constant as the gray sky above them. Reports from Allied observers described the same haunting image repeated across every town: children waiting near the edges of roads, hoping for scraps, while the remnants of the Nazi regime faded into surrender. The German population had lived for years under a carefully engineered illusion. Propaganda had portrayed the advancing American forces as barbarians, promising retribution, enslavement, and destruction. Leaflets, radio broadcasts, and speeches warned that Allied soldiers would loot and kill, that no German would be spared humiliation. Many civilians prepared for the worst, digging shelters or fleeing toward the interior of the country, clutching what little food they had left. Yet as the columns of American trucks and tanks rolled into Bavaria, Hesse, and Thuringia, the expected scenes of violence did not unfold. Instead, something incomprehensible happened. Soldiers in olive-drab uniforms began distributing food. The supplies came first from their own rations: field kits containing canned meat, condensed milk, chocolate bars, instant coffee, and powdered eggs. The same products that had fueled an army across continents now appeared in the hands of the defeated. In the early weeks after Germany's capitulation, American logistics units continued to feed millions of displaced persons, liberated prisoners, and refugees. But many soldiers went further. They noticed groups of hungry children lingering near field kitchens or supply depots and began to share what they could. Chocolate, chewing gum, and tinned fruit became the new currency of peace, small tokens that meant survival for those who had known only deprivation. For the children, the sight of enemy soldiers offering food was bewildering. Only weeks earlier, those same uniforms had represented death from the skies, the men behind the bombers that leveled Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne. Now they were standing in the streets, handing out rations from canvas sacks marked U.S. Army. German mothers watched in silence, torn between gratitude and disbelief. To accept the food was to acknowledge the end of the world they had known, yet starvation left no room for pride. Photographs taken by the U.S. Army Signal Corps captured these moments: small hands reaching out toward cans of milk, lines of children waiting beside American jeeps, soldiers kneeling to distribute food at eye level. In one image from late 1945, an American sergeant bends down to give a little girl a chocolate bar outside a school in Frankfurt. She stares at him not with fear, but with confusion, as if trying to understand how the war could end with kindness. Such moments spread quietly through ruined neighborhoods and carried a message more powerful than any proclamation of victory. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. Where propaganda had promised cruelty, the conquerors offered nourishment. The act of feeding children in a defeated land symbolized the beginning of a different kind of occupation, one built not on domination, but on responsibility. For the first time in years, the people of Germany saw that mercy could come from the direction they had been taught to fear most. The image of an American soldier handing food to a German child would remain one of the most enduring symbols of the war's aftermath, a scene where humanity momentarily triumphed over vengeance amid the ashes of a broken continent. In the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, the nation stood on the brink of collapse. Cities that had once been the engines of European industry now existed as shells of ash and twisted steel. Bombing raids had destroyed rail lines, bridges, factories, and power stations. Transportation of food became almost impossible. The rural regions that might have fed the cities were themselves devastated, stripped of manpower, livestock, and fertilizer. Entire provinces had been divided into zones of occupation, cutting off traditional trade routes. What remained of the German economy was paralyzed, and hunger began to spread like an invisible enemy across every class and region. The Allied authorities faced a humanitarian disaster of staggering proportions. By the end of 1945, over 60 million people lived in the three Western occupation zones. The wartime blockade and the systematic destruction of transport networks had left warehouses empty. The harvest of 1945 was poor, and the following winter was among the harshest in memory. Coal shortages limited the operation of flour mills and bakeries, and without fuel, food spoiled before it could be distributed. In Berlin, Cologne, and Frankfurt, families burned furniture for heat and traded whatever possessions they still had for a few potatoes. Starvation loomed not as a distant fear but as a daily reality. The nutritional crisis was documented in meticulous detail by both American and British occupation authorities. In the U.S. zone, the average civilian diet in late 1945 provided roughly 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day, barely sufficient for survival. As food imports lagged and black market activity rose, the situation worsened. By the winter of 1946 to 1947, later remembered as the Hunger Winter, rations dropped to between 1,000 and 1,500 calories, and in many localities even lower. Official statistics from German municipalities recorded widespread cases of malnutrition, edema, and exhaustion. The average adult weight declined sharply, and tuberculosis and other diet-related illnesses resurged. Children suffered the most. Schools closed for lack of heating and supplies, and those that remained open often distributed only thin soup or black bread. Medical officers of the U.S. Army and the nascent German health departments reported that thousands of children showed symptoms of rickets, anemia, and vitamin deficiency. In cities such as Hamburg and Munich, mortality among infants rose dramatically during 1946. Reports described emaciated children fainting in classrooms or collapsing in bread lines. Many had never tasted milk, fruit, or meat for months. The crisis extended beyond hunger itself. The destruction of water systems and sanitation caused outbreaks of dysentery and typhus. Refugees and displaced persons crowded into makeshift shelters, further straining already limited resources. The arrival of millions of ethnic German expellees from the East, driven out of territories ceded to Poland and the Soviet Union, intensified the pressure on food distribution. In the American zone alone, more than 5 million of these refugees arrived between 1945 and 1947, most destitute and starving. Each new trainload of arrivals deepened the sense of despair among the population. The occupying forces were confronted with a paradox. They had defeated the regime responsible for unprecedented destruction, yet they now governed its shattered remnants. Feeding the population of a country that had waged total war against them posed both logistical and moral challenges. The Allied Control Council debated how much aid could be justified without undermining the principle that Germany must not rearm or recover too quickly. The Morgenthau Plan, which had initially envisioned a deindustrialized Germany, still influenced early policy decisions, delaying large-scale food imports until late 1946. On the streets, however, policy debates meant little. Hunger erased distinctions of ideology and class. Housewives bartered jewelry for a handful of flour. Elderly men rummaged through garbage bins behind Allied kitchens. Children scavenged for cigarette butts or followed military trucks in hopes of crumbs. American soldiers on patrol saw scenes that haunted them for the rest of their lives: small bodies shivering in doorways, mothers boiling weeds or bark to make a kind of soup, men collapsing from exhaustion while queuing for bread. By the winter of 1946, hunger had become the defining condition of post-war Germany. It silenced politics, subdued resistance, and stripped life to its essentials. For many Germans, survival itself replaced any notion of pride or ideology. The war had ended, but the peace that followed demanded a new kind of endurance, one not measured by courage in battle, but by the ability to withstand hunger and despair amid the ruins of a fallen nation. Long before Germany surrendered in May 1945, American planners had anticipated that the defeat of the Third Reich would bring not only military victory but also a humanitarian catastrophe. The experience of liberated territories in Italy and France had already shown how quickly civil society could collapse once the machinery of occupation and supply was destroyed. By 1943, with Europe still under Nazi control, Washington began preparing for the day after the war. The Roosevelt administration established the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRRA, a multinational agency charged with providing emergency food, shelter, and medical aid to countries liberated from Axis rule. It operated under the authority of the Allied powers and drew its funding largely from the United States and the United Kingdom. However, the charter of UNRRA contained a crucial limitation: it was not permitted to assist citizens of the Axis nations themselves. Germany, Italy, and Japan were excluded from direct relief because the Allies viewed aid to the aggressor states as politically unacceptable during the war's immediate aftermath. UNRRA's work in Central Europe therefore focused on displaced persons, millions of former forced laborers, prisoners of war, and concentration camp survivors scattered across the continent. As Allied armies advanced, they liberated these people by the hundreds of thousands, and supplying them became an overwhelming logistical challenge. By the time Germany capitulated, UNRRA was feeding roughly 7 million displaced persons inside the former Reich's borders, yet none of its rations could be allocated to German civilians. This policy created an early and dangerous vacuum. The Allied military governments, especially in the American zone, found themselves responsible for feeding tens of millions of Germans without any civilian agency authorized to help them. In response, the U.S. War Department created a separate framework known as GARIOA, Government Aid and Relief in Occupied Areas. Officially established in 1945, GARIOA was not a humanitarian program in the moral sense but an administrative one. It ensured minimal subsistence levels to prevent disease, unrest, and political instability in the occupation zones. Under GARIOA, the U.S. Army imported grain, fats, and canned goods into Germany and distributed them through military channels and emerging local administrations. The goal was pragmatic: to maintain order and to prevent starvation from undermining reconstruction efforts. At the same time, the American military recognized that government aid alone could not cover the scale of need. Civilian charities began lobbying for permission to operate in Germany. By 1946, the U.S. authorities authorized the formation of KRALOG, the Council of Relief Agencies licensed for operation in Germany. This coalition included the American Red Cross, the Mennonite Central Committee, the Quakers American Friends Service Committee, and several Catholic and Jewish relief organizations. Together they became the first private groups allowed to deliver food, clothing, and medicine to German civilians under Allied supervision. Their shipments arrived through the port of Bremen and were distributed by local church networks across the American zone. Another organization soon emerged that would become a symbol of post-war relief: CARE, originally founded in 1945 as the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. CARE devised a simple and personal system. Private citizens in the United States could purchase a 10-kilogram package of food and have it sent directly to a family or institution in Europe. Each CARE parcel contained staples such as sugar, powdered milk, coffee, canned meat, chocolate, and margarine, enough to feed one person for about 10 days. By 1946, CARE packages were arriving in Germany in growing numbers, sometimes through relatives, sometimes as anonymous gifts. For many German families, the arrival of a brown box marked CARE USA was the first tangible sign that the hostility between nations was beginning to fade. Meanwhile, other programs slowly expanded the system of aid. In 1946, the Allied Control Council relaxed restrictions on foreign assistance, and by late that year UNICEF, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, was founded to provide food and medical support for children in war-torn countries, including Germany. Though small at first, UNICEF's milk missions soon became vital to schools and orphanages. These overlapping efforts formed the backbone of early post-war recovery, bridging the gap between occupation policy and the moral imperative to alleviate suffering. The combined network of GARIOA, KRALOG, CARE, and later UNICEF transformed the devastated landscape of post-war Germany into a field of unprecedented humanitarian cooperation. What had begun as a military responsibility evolved into a global relief system involving churches, governments, and ordinary citizens. Each crate of flour, each can of milk, and each chocolate bar represented more than calories. They were symbols of a new relationship between conqueror and conquered. Behind every shipment stood a quiet shift in philosophy, the recognition that rebuilding Europe required not only political control but also compassion, and that even the defeated deserved a chance to survive. In the first months after the German surrender, before any formal system of aid or relief had taken shape, the initial spark of compassion came not from institutions but from individuals. The Allied occupation began under strict orders. Soldiers were forbidden to fraternize with the local population, to exchange goods, or to show any personal kindness that might undermine military discipline. The official policy of non-fraternization, announced by General Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1945, was designed to maintain order and prevent resentment among troops who had spent years fighting the very people they now occupied. For several weeks after Germany's capitulation, signs in American camps reminded soldiers that talking to civilians, especially German women and children, was a punishable offense. The war might have ended, but mistrust lingered like smoke over the ruins. Yet reality quickly overwhelmed regulations. The scale of suffering visible in every German city was something few soldiers had been prepared for. In towns such as Würzburg, Kassel, and Nuremberg, they found streets filled with orphans, widows, and refugees. Children rummaged through army trash pits searching for food. Old men collapsed beside the roads. Mothers bartered wedding rings for a single loaf of bread. The destruction was so complete that to enforce non-fraternization would have meant turning away from human misery on a scale that defied comprehension. Gradually, acts of disobedience began to multiply. Soldiers on kitchen duty slipped extra bread into buckets for disposal. Drivers tossed candy or cigarettes from the backs of trucks. Medics shared water or medicine with the sick. By the summer of 1945, these gestures had become a quiet but widespread phenomenon across the American zone. Field kitchens stationed near Frankfurt or Stuttgart were often surrounded by small crowds of children waiting patiently, hoping to be noticed. Many soldiers started bringing their leftovers out after meals or setting aside pieces of canned fruit for the next day's crowd. Photographs from U.S. Army Signal Corps archives show long lines of thin, barefoot children clustered near Army jeeps, their faces lifted toward men handing down tin cups of soup or powdered milk. There was no order or instruction behind these moments, only instinct. The men of the Third Army, who had fought through France and the Ardennes under General Patton, were among those first confronted with the humanitarian reality of victory. Their diaries and letters revealed the same conflict, exhaustion mixed with pity. Many of them admitted to breaking rules deliberately, arguing that feeding a starving child could not be a crime. A corporal from the 26th Infantry Division later recalled how entire platoons quietly pooled their rations to feed groups of orphans camped near their barracks. Chocolate, chewing gum, and instant coffee, once luxuries of the American field kit, became tokens of peace. These spontaneous acts did more than alleviate hunger. They transformed the tone of the occupation. German civilians, conditioned by years of propaganda that depicted Americans as monsters, found themselves unable to reconcile that image with the reality before them. The sight of an American soldier kneeling to hand food to a barefoot child cut through the residue of hatred that years of war had built. In neighborhoods once ruled by fear, laughter began to return in small, hesitant bursts. Children followed convoys not in terror, but in curiosity. For many, the first English words they learned were the names of candies. Chocolate, gum, cookie. Word of these unregulated acts spread quickly among units. Some commanders, recognizing their morale value, quietly tolerated them. Others turned a blind eye altogether, aware that such gestures were doing more to pacify the population than any official decree could. Eventually, the rigid rules of non-fraternization began to erode, and by late 1945 the ban was formally lifted in the American zone. What had begun as disobedience had, in effect, become policy. The catalyst of change in post-war Germany was therefore not a grand political decision or a diplomatic agreement, but a simple, human impulse, an unplanned recognition that mercy was more powerful than authority. Those first moments, when soldiers broke the silence of occupation to share a piece of their own food, marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the relationship between conqueror and conquered. Out of hunger and ruin, a fragile form of trust began to grow, carried not by governments, but by hands that offered food where once they had carried weapons. By 1946, the spontaneous acts of compassion that had begun in the streets of occupied Germany evolved into an organized and carefully structured system of humanitarian relief. The American military government, realizing that ad hoc generosity could not sustain millions of civilians through consecutive harsh winters, began transforming charity into policy. What had once been the private initiative of soldiers and chaplains became a coordinated network that united government agencies, church missions, and international organizations under a single administrative framework. The central aim was no longer just to feed the starving, but to stabilize society, prevent disease, and restore the basic rhythms of civilian life. The cornerstone of this effort was the Council of Relief Agencies license for operation in Germany, KRALOG. Officially sanctioned by the U.S. War Department in early 1946, KRALOG brought together more than 24 American and international charities, including the American Red Cross, the Catholic Relief Services, the Mennonite Central Committee, the Quakers American Friends Service Committee, and Jewish Welfare Federations. These organizations were granted permission to import and distribute relief goods within the American zone of occupation, operating under supervision of the Office of Military Government for Germany, OMDIS. KRALOG's structure allowed for the efficient pooling of donations from across the United States: money, clothing, canned food, powdered milk, medical supplies, and their shipment by sea to the port of Bremen, which served as the logistical gateway to occupied Germany. Once the supplies arrived, distribution followed a strict hierarchy. Military transport units escorted the shipments to regional depots, from which local German authorities and church networks took responsibility for final delivery. In many cities, the old parish halls and schools became distribution centers, where families queued for packages of flour, sugar, margarine, and cooking oil. Reports from OMDIS in 1946 to 1947 described KRALOG's reach as remarkable. By the end of its first full year, the organization had delivered over 200,000 tons of relief goods, reaching millions of Germans who otherwise faced chronic malnutrition. Its work provided the first signs of order and predictability in a landscape still defined by chaos. Parallel to KRALOG's institutional operations, another initiative began reshaping the emotional and moral dimension of relief: the rise of CARE, the Cooperative for American Remittances to Europe. Founded in 1945, CARE introduced a deeply personal form of assistance. Instead of impersonal government rations, individuals in the United States could purchase a pre-packed 10-kilogram parcel and have it sent to a recipient of their choice, or anonymously to a family in need. Each box, designed from surplus U.S. Army field rations, contained essentials that had become unimaginable luxuries in post-war Germany: canned meat, condensed milk, sugar, instant coffee, chocolate, and even cigarettes. The symbolic power of these parcels was immense. For many recipients, the arrival of a CARE package was the first tangible link to a world beyond ruin, proof that compassion could cross oceans and national boundaries. By the end of 1946, tens of thousands of such packages were arriving monthly, distributed through both postal services and church networks. In the same year, attention turned specifically to the plight of children. Malnutrition among the young threatened to produce an entire generation weakened by hunger and disease. In December 1946, the newly founded United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, was established to address this crisis. Germany, despite being an ex-enemy state, was soon included in its programs under Allied supervision. UNICEF's milk missions supplied powdered milk, cod liver oil, and fortified biscuits to schools, hospitals, and orphanages across the American zone. These small rations, often only a cup of milk and a slice of bread per child per day, made a measurable difference in public health. In Hamburg, Munich, and Nuremberg, mortality rates among children dropped within months of the program's introduction. The American military government, which had initially treated relief as a temporary measure, gradually institutionalized it as part of the reconstruction of West Germany. Detailed nutritional surveys were conducted by AMGAS and the United States Army Quartermaster Corps, ensuring that food imports met caloric targets and were equitably distributed. Local governments were required to maintain transparent ration cards and submit reports verifying that aid reached the most vulnerable populations: children, the elderly, and the sick. Church volunteers, German nurses, and social workers became an essential part of this machinery of survival. By 1947, the process had taken on the character of a national lifeline. Ships docked in Bremen almost weekly, unloading Kralog and care supplies. Railcars painted with the American flag carried food deep into Bavaria and Hesse. Public kitchens opened in bombed-out buildings, serving thin but steady meals of soup and bread. Posters urged cooperation with the slogan, "Hilf uns helfen, help us to help." For the first time since the war's end, the word organization no longer meant repression or control, but relief and coordination. This system, fragile yet effective, represented a turning point in post-war history. What had begun as unregulated generosity evolved into one of the earliest multinational humanitarian infrastructures of the 20th century. Each parcel of sugar or powdered milk symbolized more than nourishment. It was an acknowledgement that rebuilding Germany required not only material aid but also moral reconstruction. The process of feeding the defeated had become the foundation for reconciling enemies and for teaching a generation that mercy could be a deliberate act of policy, not just a fleeting impulse of compassion. Across the occupied zones of Germany, the daily reality of aid took shape not in political offices or warehouses, but in streets, schools, and kitchens. By 1946, the abstract concept of relief had become visible in the routines of millions of ordinary people. What had once been unimaginable, a former enemy feeding the children of its adversary, now played out quietly in classrooms, soup lines, and church basements. The results of these efforts could be seen most vividly in the urban centers of the American zone: Munich, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Bremen, and Hamburg. In those cities, where devastation had been most complete, the rhythms of post-war survival were measured by the arrival of food trucks, the opening of community kitchens, and the sound of ladles striking metal pots. Children were the first to feel the difference. Schools, many of them still operating in damaged buildings or temporary barracks, became hubs for daily feeding programs. Under the supervision of local administrators and American oversight teams, thousands of Schulspeisungen, school meal services, were introduced. In Hamburg alone, over 200,000 children were fed each day by late 1946. The meals were simple: a bowl of vegetable soup, sometimes thickened with barley or lentils, accompanied by a small piece of bread. The average portion contained about 300 calories, a modest but vital addition to otherwise meager family rations. For many children, it was the only warm meal of the day. Teachers recorded the changes in attendance and energy. Where once exhaustion and fainting had been common, students began to return to class with renewed strength. In Bremen, similar programs flourished under the cooperation of church charities and Kralog representatives. American supplies, powdered milk, flour, sugar, and canned vegetables, were distributed from improvised kitchens set up in schoolyards and warehouses. Local women volunteered as cooks, stirring enormous cauldrons of soup over makeshift stoves fueled by salvaged coal. Even the smallest details of these scenes conveyed the scale of recovery: the careful counting of ladles to ensure fairness, the presence of Allied officers checking temperature and hygiene, the laughter of children queuing with tin cups. The sensory contrast between wartime deprivation and post-war relief was profound. For children who had grown up in bomb shelters, the taste of food from across the ocean, American canned meat, powdered cocoa, or chocolate, was almost surreal. Bananas and oranges, imported through U.S. supply lines, became mythical objects. In diaries preserved from 1946 and 1947, many German children wrote about their first encounters with such foods: the sweetness of condensed milk, the smell of coffee, the texture of white bread after years of black rye substitutes. One Hamburg schoolgirl described it simply as the first taste of peace. These personal testimonies, gathered later by German historians and social workers, showed that the emotional impact of the aid often exceeded its nutritional value. The soldiers and volunteers who distributed these supplies also experienced transformation. For many Americans, accustomed to viewing Germany through the lens of wartime propaganda, the sight of skeletal children and desperate families forced a reevaluation of victory itself. Relief work became a form of moral restoration. Reports from the Office of Military Government noted that acts of generosity in the field improved relations between troops and civilians more effectively than any leaflet or speech. Soldiers who once guarded ration depots now served food, and local residents began to approach them without fear. The barrier between occupier and occupied gradually eroded through repetition of simple, humane interactions. The material process of distribution required immense coordination. Each school kitchen maintained detailed ledgers of the number of meals served, the quantity of ingredients used, and the caloric content of each portion. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and Kralog inspectors regularly audited these records to ensure that no corruption or black market diversion occurred. Despite the bureaucratic structure, much of the success depended on human initiative, on German teachers who reopened schools in ruins, on American logisticians who diverted surplus military rations, and on volunteers who worked through freezing winters with limited fuel. These local experiences collectively reshaped the psychological landscape of occupied Germany. In neighborhoods where the only prior contact with Americans had been through air raids, the daily presence of soldiers distributing milk and bread carried immense symbolic weight. For parents, it meant their children might live through another winter. For the children themselves, it introduced a new image of the United States, not as an army of destruction, but as a source of care. The gratitude that emerged from these moments was quiet but enduring, often recorded not in official documents, but in memory. By the end of 1947, the field experience of relief had already begun to bridge the moral divide left by the war. Each shared meal, each smile exchanged over a bowl of soup, became part of a larger, unspoken dialogue between nations. In those small, practical acts of feeding, the idea of reconciliation found its first and most tangible expression. What began as survival had evolved into the slow rehumanization of everyday life, one spoonful at a time. By the late 1940s, the quiet gestures of American soldiers and aid workers in post-war Germany had transformed into one of the most powerful narratives of reconciliation in modern history. What had begun as isolated acts of kindness in ruined streets became emblematic of a broader transformation in the relationship between victors and the vanquished. Newspapers, photographs, and newsreels captured the faces of children holding chocolate bars, cans of milk, and small American flags, images that stood in stark contrast to the destruction that had defined the previous decade. These moments were not staged propaganda. They were fragments of genuine human connection that quickly entered the moral vocabulary of the post-war world. The cumulative effect of relief efforts reshaped public perception across occupied Germany. In the American zone, where material aid was most consistent, surveys conducted by the Office of Military Government in 1947 showed a significant decline in hostility toward the United States. Germans who had once regarded American soldiers as conquerors increasingly described them as protectors or providers. In villages where Kralog and care supplies arrived regularly, trust in the occupying administration rose dramatically. Relief had become a form of diplomacy, its success measured not in tons of cargo but in the slow erosion of resentment. The concept of re-education, once rooted in abstract lectures about democracy, now found its practical counterpart in the act of feeding the hungry. Internationally, these images served to redefine the moral identity of the United States at a critical moment in global politics. As tensions with the Soviet Union deepened into the early stages of the Cold War, American policymakers recognized the symbolic value of humanitarian aid. The sight of American soldiers distributing food in a devastated Europe reinforced the idea of a benevolent power committed not only to victory but to reconstruction. This vision found its most dramatic expression during the Berlin airlift of 1948 to 1949, known as Operation Vittles. When the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off all land and rail access, the United States and its allies launched an unprecedented air operation to sustain more than 2 million civilians by air alone. Over the course of nearly a year, Western aircraft delivered more than 2.3 million tons of supplies, coal, flour, milk, and medicine, into the isolated city. For Berliners, each plane that appeared over the rooftops symbolized not merely survival but hope. Yet among the thousands of flights that made up Operation Vittles, one in particular captured the world's imagination. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, an American pilot, began dropping small packages of candy attached to handmade parachutes during his supply runs. His initiative, affectionately named Operation Little Vittles, turned into a phenomenon. Within months, children across Berlin waited eagerly for the planes marked by a wagging wing, a signal that candy would soon descend from the sky. Halvorsen's gesture, though modest, became a cultural touchstone. Newspapers from New York to London to Tokyo published photographs of Berlin children collecting the tiny parachutes, their smiles framed by the ruins of a divided city. The story embodied the same principle that had guided earlier relief efforts, that compassion could achieve what ideology could not. The U.S. Air Force quickly adopted the project, and donations of candy and handkerchiefs poured in from American schoolchildren and manufacturers. By the end of the airlift, over 20 tons of sweets had been delivered to Berlin's children, an act of symbolic nourishment that carried immense political weight. The emotional resonance of these efforts extended beyond Germany. They became part of a new moral narrative for the United States, presenting its global role as one of reconstruction rather than domination. The visual language of post-war aid, the open hands, the milk cans, the parachutes of chocolate, contrasted sharply with images of wartime destruction and helped shape America's emerging image as a humanitarian superpower. This perception played a crucial role in rallying European support for the Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, which offered billions of dollars in economic recovery aid. In German memory, the images of American kindness became intertwined with the birth of a new society. The children who had once stood barefoot in ration lines grew up associating their first taste of milk or chocolate with the soldiers who had once been their enemies. Sociological studies conducted in the 1950s revealed that gratitude toward the United States remained one of the defining attitudes among the generation that experienced those early years of relief. Even decades later, Halvorsen himself, known affectionately as the Candy Bomber, was welcomed in Germany as a national hero, a living reminder of how mercy had bridged the abyss left by war. The spread of these stories across media, memoirs, and public commemoration turned the humanitarian occupation of Germany into something larger than policy. It became a moral parable of the 20th century. It demonstrated that nations could wield compassion as a strategic tool and that acts of generosity could carry more enduring influence than military power. Through countless small gestures, food offered, packages delivered, and parachutes dropped from the sky, the United States redefined not only its relationship with Germany but also the very meaning of victory in the modern age. In the years that followed the war, the memory of hunger and relief became deeply woven into the moral fabric of a new Germany. The experience of being fed by former enemies left a profound imprint on those who had lived through the ruins. For many Germans, particularly children, the arrival of American aid marked their first encounter with an alternative vision of power, one defined not by domination, but by generosity. The contrast between wartime propaganda, which had portrayed the Americans as ruthless invaders, and the post-war reality of soldiers handing out food and milk created a quiet psychological transformation that would shape the country's recovery for decades. The process of rebuilding the German state was inseparable from this moral reorientation. The young people who had stood in line for school meals and care packages in 1946 and 1947 grew into adults during the formative years of the Federal Republic of Germany. They carried with them memories of deprivation and redemption, of a world destroyed by ideology and repaired through compassion. In oral histories recorded during the 1950s and 1960s, many recalled their first encounters with American aid not as acts of charity, but as moments that restored their sense of dignity. The simple fact that someone cared enough to feed them became an emotional foundation for the democratic values later embraced by West German society. This moral awakening coincided with the practical success of Reconstruction. Under the Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, billions of dollars of economic assistance flowed into Western Europe, including West Germany. Factories reopened, cities were rebuilt, and the Deutsche Mark stabilized. Yet beneath the statistics of economic growth lay something more intangible: the belief that cooperation and trust could replace aggression and suspicion. The relationship between the United States and West Germany evolved from occupation to partnership, forming the cornerstone of the Western Alliance during the Cold War. The humanitarian gestures that had once seemed small and personal now appeared, in retrospect, as the first steps in forging a political and cultural bond that would define post-war Europe. The legacy of these early relief efforts also influenced Germany's post-war identity. As the nation regained sovereignty and prosperity in the 1950s, its leaders and citizens alike drew lessons from their own experience of receiving aid. West Germany became one of the first countries to institutionalize international development assistance, contributing to UNICEF, the World Food Programme, and later to reconstruction efforts in Asia and Africa. The principle that no society should allow hunger to persist, rooted in memories of the Hunger Years of 1945 to 1947, became a moral cornerstone of the new republic's foreign policy. For Americans, the experience of rebuilding Germany reaffirmed a belief in the power of democratic ideals expressed through action. The success of humanitarian programs demonstrated that moral leadership could be as effective a tool of influence as military strength. The U.S. Army and its civil affairs divisions, once trained solely for combat, became pioneers in a new kind of warfare, one fought with food, education, and infrastructure. This approach shaped American foreign policy throughout the second half of the 20th century, from the Peace Corps to post-war reconstruction in later conflicts. The emotional resonance of post-war relief also endured in cultural memory. Photographs of smiling children receiving chocolate from American soldiers appeared in history books and documentaries, becoming symbols of reconciliation. The story of Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, the candy bomber, of the Berlin airlift, continued to be told in schools across both countries, representing the human face of diplomacy. Monuments, exhibitions, and anniversaries commemorated not only the destruction of war but also the moments of kindness that followed it. In the decades that followed, as Germany and the United States grew into allies and economic partners, the memory of those first years remained a quiet moral thread binding the two nations. The shared history of devastation and compassion served as a reminder that reconciliation was possible not through treaties alone, but through empathy and concrete action. The children who once depended on American food aid became part of a generation that rebuilt Europe on the foundations of democracy, cooperation, and human dignity. Thus, the legacy of post-war relief extended far beyond calories and rations. It redefined what victory could mean. It showed that power, when tempered by mercy, could heal rather than humiliate. In a century marked by destruction, the simple act of feeding the defeated proved that the moral strength of democracy lay not in its ability to conquer, but in its capacity to forgive, to rebuild, and to nurture life where ideology had once demanded ruin. The story of American soldiers feeding German children stood as one of the quietest yet most profound transformations to emerge from the wreckage of the Second World War. It revealed that the ultimate defeat of tyranny did not come solely through the destruction of armies or the signing of treaties, but through the reawakening of moral conscience. Amid the ruins of a continent that had glorified domination and racial hierarchy, a simple act of mercy became an argument stronger than ideology. It showed that the true victory of democracy was not measured by territory or military might, but by its ability to preserve humanity when history seemed intent on erasing it. In the aftermath of such vast cruelty, compassion was not a given, it was a deliberate choice. The American soldiers who extended food to children acted in defiance of bitterness, revenge, and the emotional numbness that years of war had bred. Their gestures carried no political instruction, yet they functioned as moral lessons more powerful than any proclamation of policy. Feeding the enemy's child became a symbolic act of reconstruction, one that rebuilt not just bodies but the very idea of civilization. In those moments, power and mercy briefly ceased to be opposites. The conqueror did not humiliate the defeated. Instead, he restored their humanity, and in doing so, reaffirmed his own. This transformation unfolded not in speeches or grand diplomatic halls, but in the smallest of spaces, in kitchens, schoolyards, and marketplaces. There, where suffering had stripped life down to its essentials, the exchange of food became an exchange of meaning. A piece of bread or a bar of chocolate carried within it the promise that human beings could choose empathy over vengeance. Each shared meal became a rejection of the logic that had fueled the war, that some lives were worth more than others. In the quiet act of giving, democracy expressed its truest form, not as ideology, but as conduct. The power of this moral reversal lay in its simplicity. The same hands that once carried rifles now held rations. The same uniforms that had symbolized destruction became symbols of generosity. To the German children who received this unexpected kindness, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. What they saw was not an occupying army, but a human being offering survival. That moment redefined the moral geography of the post-war world. For them, the face of the former enemy became the face of renewal, a living proof that even after unspeakable violence, compassion could still be possible. Historically, these acts did not end hunger overnight, nor did they erase the trauma of war. But they left behind a moral residue that shaped the consciousness of a generation. The memory of being fed by the enemy lingered long after the taste of food had faded. It became a story told in families, schools, and public life, a reminder that reconciliation begins not with words, but with deeds. In that sense, every soldier who shared a meal performed a kind of moral diplomacy, building bridges invisible yet stronger than treaties. For the Americans, the act of giving reaffirmed something essential about their own national identity. It proved that victory without humanity was hollow, and that the endurance of democratic values depended not on dominance, but on the willingness to act with mercy even when it was not required. Feeding the former enemy was not weakness, it was strength, the strength to transcend hatred, to assert that human worth is indivisible, even in defeat. Ultimately, the image of an American soldier handing chocolate to a German child transcended the specific time and place in which it occurred. It became a universal emblem of moral recovery, a vision of how civilization repairs itself after collapse. In that silent exchange, the war truly ended. Not in the signing of documents or the drawing of borders, but in a gesture that acknowledged the shared fragility of life. The moment the conqueror fed the conquered, the boundaries between them dissolved, and what remained was the oldest truth of all, that humanity endures not through power or ideology, but through compassion, extended quietly, one open hand at a time.